Good morning. This is Bonnie McFarland, and welcome to our final meeting for 2020. It's 10:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Our team is with us today. Most of the team you'll hear from later on in our meetings. We sent out, just a reminder, we sent out a list of meeting dates for January through June of 2021, and we'll post those dates on our website just so you have those listed. If you're currently registered for meetings, there's no need to re-register. So you'll receive a notification prior to each of the meetings. You're already registered, but we wanted to have you have the new dates. We plan to continue meeting via Zoom for the rest of the school year, unless something drastically changes. So hold those dates. Our next meeting is scheduled for January 21st of 2020. We will have some other upcoming meetings and workshops. We will be doing some toward the end of January when we get the information on the final LCAP annual update templates. We'll be doing some training on that. And January 11th through the 13th, we'll have a series of meetings on our fiscal basics workshop that we do once a year. So that information will be going out by tomorrow. So hold the dates on those. So let's take a look at our agenda for today. Today, our meeting is going to include updates on a number of topics and a review of some information that we've shared previously. Just a reminder, we don't want to add too much to your to-do list, so hopefully you can get some time off over the holidays, but we will be looking at some CalPADS reminders and specifically those related to your particular areas. And we'll also be reviewing the LCAP Federal Addendum and some requirements, information on that, an update on the budget overview, some next steps. We'll look at FPM and one of the new compliance instruments relative to the CARES Act. Then we'll have an update on the annual update and what we know about that for this year's annual update for the LCAP and the continuity plan. And then we have a number of other smaller updates on things that we just want you to be aware of. So as usual, we will be using the chat to collect your questions. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll answer any that we can at this time. But as usual, we'll follow up with a Q&A that's mailed to everyone who is registered for the meetings, and we'll post it on our website. So please include your questions there. Also, we have a Zoom link for our a link for our Q&A, I'm sorry. The responses to all our Q&A documents for the Zoom meetings we've done this year can be found at this link, and you'll also find the presentation slides from all our meetings there. So if there's something you missed or you want to go back and take a look at something, all of those documents are available to you. So today we're going to start off with Evan, and he's going to start off with an update and a few reminders on CalPADS data collection topics that are of particular impact to your work. So Evan, take it away.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yes, nothing says screams holidays like CalPADS Fall 1 certification. But I just want to review a few final steps for the CalPADS Fall 1 submission that are critical for state and federal funding, as well as for federal accountability. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to begin with a quick reminder that this year, although LEAs are being held harmless for the ADA calculation in determining the LCFF base grant funding, the CDE is using the Fall 1 data that LEA is certified to determine the supplemental concentration grant allocation. So tomorrow, December 18th, is the Fall 1 certification deadline for LEAs, and the data certified will be used for the first principal apportionment calculations. And although special education data is now part of the Fall 1 collection, because it doesn't affect the S&C apportionment, it isn't necessary to have your SELPA certification by tomorrow, although most LEAs probably do. The CDE will use the data that LEAs certify or recertify by the close of the amendment window, which is January 29th, for the second principal apportionment calculations. So I'm going to give you some actions that you still have time to take before that window. Next slide, please. So on the next few slides, I'll be providing just a checklist of actions that LEAs can use prior to the close of the CalPADS amendment window. And just remember, January 29th is the close of the fall amendment window. That's kind of it for fall one, but there still is time to take these steps to ensure that your LEA maximizes its LCFF supplemental concentration funding for the P2 period for that allocation by including every eligible student that's in your unduplicated pupil count. So the first thing LEA should do, and it just, as always, whoever's closest to this data, it's your CalPADS person, but also usually a program person who's there to review it, part of your, hopefully you have a data governance team of some sort. You should ensure that a program record has been submitted for every student that the LEA has identified as eligible for free or reduced price meals. And as we outlined in a prior presentation, because of the pandemic, the collection of documentation has changed this year. So any student can be included in the free reduced price meal count if they either submitted the National School Lunch Program application, so long as it was submitted or it was distributed before October 9th, it can be received by December 31st, so students could be included, or any student who submits an alternative household income information form by December 31st. Also, any student who qualifies through the local direct certification by December 31st would be eligible for your UPC count. And so the local certification could be county welfare agency match, sibling extensions, or categorical eligibility. I've included a link to the CDE's November letter to superintendents detailing these adjusted requirements for collecting the FRPM data on the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. So in addition to low income students, LEAs should ensure that all identified English learners are included as part of the unduplicated pupil count. So your EL and or your assessment staff have until today to administer the initial LPAC online or paper pencil. And if the results are entered into Tom's data entry interface and received by CalPADS, they'll be included in the unduplicated pupil count for P1. However, you do have a little bit of a window there. If students have completed all 4 domains and the information is entered into the TOM system by December 31st, and the English language acquisition status of EL is received by CalPADS by then, they will be counted for your UPC for P2. So you do have until December 31st to get that information in. So if anybody's working early next week and can make sure you capture all of it. I know there's been a lot of challenges in getting everyone tested with that initial assessment. So you do have a little bit of breathing room to get that in. Also, staff should ensure that students who've been identified for any of the categories of homeless, migrant, or tribal foster on or before October 7th, which was Census Day this year, have the appropriate program records in CalPADS. So check on those. Next slide, please. And this is a reminder that for the 2021 school year, the U.S. Department of Ed is allowing states to report students with the language acquisition status of EL or TBD, so to be determined, they'll count those as English learners. Accordingly, for federal reporting purposes only, the CDE will report as an English learner all students who are enrolled on Census Day who have the ELAS status of EL or TBD. So LEAs will certify these counts on their certification report 2.8, which is the English language acquisition status count by primary language. And this report isn't being adjusted. They're just, the CDE is simply including both the EL and TBD students in the English learner count that's reported to ED. Just a note, if you have students who are still TBD and you've exceeded the window in which they're supposed to be tested, you should have some documentation as to why they weren't assessed yet with the initial assessment. So somewhere in their CUME or somewhere should be documentation of that. So someone in the LEA, possibly your EL coordinator, should verify the counts of students with these EL status of EL or TBD against that match. And just remember, they're not going to match. The 2.8 numbers for EL will not match your report 1.17, which is the FRPM English learner and foster youth count, because it's a little bit different this year. The state's actually being more stringent. For LCFF purposes, you have to be an EL to be counted in the unduplicated pupil count, but an English learner for the purposes of Title III can be EL or TBD. Next slide, please. And finally, an LEA should verify the Title III eligible immigrant count. So you do this on report 2.1 or report 2.2, and just eligible students, a reminder, are between the ages of 3 and 21. They have a birth country outside of the US or Puerto Rico. and they've been enrolled in a US school less than 3 cumulative years. And to qualify for the Title III immigrant funding, the LEA's count of eligible students must have increased from the previous year by at least 1%. Also, for federal reporting purposes, an LEA should verify students who've been reclassified fluent English proficient for the 1920 count using report 2.12. That's the English language acquisition status, EL's reclassified report. And this would include all students who were reclassified between October 3rd of 2019 and October 7th of 2020, so earlier this year. It may include any students who took the optional 1920 summative LPAC which was offered through October 30th of this year. And in that case, their ELAS file, the start date should be backdated to October 7th so that they can be counted. So that's just one last reminder on that. And now I am handing it off to Rachel.
Thank you, Evan. Good morning, everyone. So in this section, we just have a few updates and reminders regarding the LCAP Federal Addendum. Next slide, please. As a reminder, LEAs that apply for ESSA funds are required to complete the LCAP Federal Addendum. The LCAP Federal Addendum is meant to supplement the LCAP. So together, the LCAP, the Federal Addendum, and the CONAP meet the ESSA LEA plan requirements. The Federal Addendum is only required to be submitted to the CDE for approval once during the current authorization of ESEA. This means that LEAs are not required to annually resubmit their updated addendum to the CDE. The addendums that were submitted to the CDE during the summer of 2019 for the 2019-20 school year were recently approved by the State Board of Education at its September 2020 State Board meeting. And LEAs should have received a letter from CDE last month informing them of this approval. Again, the addendum does not need to be resubmitted to the CDE each year. So if your 1920 addendum was approved, you do not need to resubmit it for the 2020-21 school year. LEAs that applied for ESSA funding for the first time in 2020-21, however, will need to complete and submit an LCAP Federal Addendum for CDE approval in the 2020-21 school year. And that also goes for LEAs applying for a specific ESSA program for the first time. So for example, if an LEA has an approved addendum, but is applying for, let's say, Title IV for the first time in 2020-21, then the LEA will need to complete and submit the Title IV section of the addendum for approval from CDE. Next slide, please. So here is a screenshot of the CDE approval letter that was sent to LEAs last month. And in addition to informing LEAs of CDE approval of the LCAP Federal Addendum, the letter also provided some important reminders regarding revising and posting the addendum. Next slide, please. So as stated in the CDE addendum approval letter, LEAs are required to periodically review and revise their federal addendum as necessary per ESSA. Basically, your LCAP federal addendum should match your current programs and address what you are currently doing in your LEA with federal funds. If your addendum does not match your current programs, then it needs to be updated. Revisions and updates to the federal addendum are to be made at the local level and do not need to be submitted to the CDE unless required by an individual title program office. And revisions to the addendum should be approved by the local governing board. Also, please note that LEAs are now required to prominently post the approved LCAP federal addendum and any revisions on the LEA's homepage per SB 820. Next slide, please. The LCAP federal addendum is monitored through the FPM process. The program instrument for supporting effective instruction, item 3, specifically monitors the requirement to review and revise the federal addendum. For this item, LEAs will be asked to submit both their original CDE approved LCAP federal addendum, as well as their current revised addendum. It's important to note that reviewers will be looking at the LEA's whole federal addendum and not just the Title II section for this item to determine if the LEA is reviewing and revising its addendum as required per ESSA. Other evidence for this item includes materials from local governing board meetings and/or other LEA documents that provide evidence of implementation and monitoring of the LEA's programs. So as previously mentioned, your addendum needs to match your current programs, and FPM reviewers will be looking at whether or not your addendum matches what you're currently doing in your district. EL4 is another area in which the LCAP federal addendum may be reviewed. LEAs that receive Title III funds are required to annually update, implement, and monitor a Title III plan for the use of Title III funds. For this item, LEAs may submit their LCAP federal addendum as evidence if the Title III section has been updated for the current year. If the Title III section of the addendum has not been updated to reflect the current year, then it may not necessarily meet the Title III plan requirement. During the CDE's FPM training last week, one of the EL reviewers stated that the federal addendum would need to show how the LEA plans to spend Title III funds for the current year in order to be accepted as evidence for this item. Next slide, please. So one area of the addendum that we know will need to be updated for all LEAs is the Title I Part A Educator Equity provision. This provision requires LEAs to describe how they will identify and address any disparities that result in low income and minority students being taught at higher rates than other students by ineffective, inexperienced, or out-of-field teachers. At its November 2019 State Board meeting, the State Board of Education approved new definitions of ineffective and out-of-field teachers. As such, this section will need to be updated to reflect California's new definitions of ineffective and out-of-field teachers. Under the new definitions, an ineffective teacher includes those teaching with provisional internship permits, short-term staff permits, variable term waivers, and substitute permits or TPSL holders serving as the teacher of record. An out-of-field teacher now includes short-term waivers, emergency English learner or bilingual authorization permits, and local assignment options. And we've included the CDE website link to these definitions on this slide. Next slide, please. The CDE has developed the Promoting Equitable Access to Teachers, or PEAT program, to assist LEAs to identify and address local disparities or equity gaps. A key element of the PEAT program is a suite of equity tools designed to guide LEAs as they collect and analyze data, connect data analyses to identify potential equity gaps, conduct a root cause analysis, and consider various strategies to address disparities while engaging stakeholders throughout the process. We've included the links to these resources on this slide. The first link listed is to the PEAT video series, which is a 7-part series. Currently, 2 of the 7 videos are posted. The first video provides an overview of the PEAT program, and the second addresses the new definitions of ineffective and out-of-field teachers. The second link provided is to the PEAT program webpage, which also provides a number of tools and resources to support LEAs with this work. And the CDE has also indicated that additional resources in this area are forthcoming. And that concludes the LCAP federal addendum, so I will now turn it back over to Evan.
Thank you, Rachel. So the budget overview for parents was, the deadline was December 15th. So most LEAs have submitted their budget overview in the ELCAP. And we just wanted to give a quick little overview of the next steps, what's going to happen here at the county for those of you who may have either been directly involved with that, or maybe called upon after the fact if there's any necessary changes or revisions. So next slide, please. So the LACO team will be reviewing, and the team includes both our business advisory services team as well as our unit. We'll be looking at the budget overview, or BOP, for the following things. So there's a section marked the projected general fund revenue for the 2021 school year. So the BOP will be reviewed by our business advisory services folks by looking at the first interim report, Form 01, that is also required to have been approved and submitted. The section that's identified as the total budgeted expenditures for the 2021 school year, we'll compare the BOP, what's listed there, to make sure that it aligns with the district or the LEAs. This is only, by the way, for districts. So this is only districts that are being subjected to this review process, just to be clear. So we'll look at the submitted learning continuity and attendance plan to make sure that the expenditures outlined there are aligned. That's for both the all expenditures and expenditures identified as contributing to increased or improved services. And then finally, in the section that's marked the expenditures for high need students for the 1920 school year, so that was in the last formally submitted LCAP, we'll compare the amount that was identified for the total budgeted expenditures by looking at the previous year's, the last submitted budget overview for parents, to make sure that lines up. And then we'll also look at the narrative responses to make sure that they are fully addressed, and also that they're visible, because the template does not auto adjust. So we know that when saved as a PDF, sometimes parts of those narrative responses are cut off. Next slide, please. So this is just a kind of a graphic that shows the different sections, so that the budgeted expenditures part, and this has been tricky, just to add it all up, unlike the original plan for the expenditure tables, which was in the LCAP, the learning continuity plan didn't have any automatic way for things to add up. So we've gone through, or we'll be going through, and making sure that those numbers all line up. The entry for the sum of all actions, so we want to make sure that you have both the all actions and those actions marked as contributing are accurate. And I know that in some instances, districts may have entered an action as being repeated, so make sure that they weren't counted more than one time if that's the case. And then finally, looking back at the expenditures for high need students in 1920 to make sure that the amount identified last year lines up and with what's entered for this year. Next slide, please. So the LCAP coordinator will reach out to the school district, depending on who had submitted or is listed as a contact, to discuss any necessary changes. Just a note though, if there has been an update to the learning continuity plan, and since we're going to be comparing those numbers to what's in the BOP, if there's been an update, please submit that revised plan to LACO through our ELCAP system, and we do check there. And it'd also be helpful to notify us that you're uploading a new revised version. So we'll compare the right version of your learning continuity plan against the budget overview to make sure that the numbers align. And finally, we want to remind everybody that the budget overview for parents should be posted on your LEA homepage, along with your 2021 learning continuity plan. And a little later on, Bonnie's going to be talking about some additional postings. So we have a listing for you of all the things that should be posted. And that is it for me. I'm handing it off again now to Adrian.
Well, good morning, everyone. Today, I will give you a quick update on the 2021 FPM reviews, and then go a little more in depth with the new CARES Act instrument that was just posted last week on December 9th. So for the 2021 FPM reviews for this school year, it will remain in the telemonitoring format, which again includes some Zoom interviews and meetings through the Zoom format. Also, last week, CDE had a FPM training, and so we sent out an invite to everyone. Hopefully you were able to sign on and be able to participate in any of those programs that were being presented. It took place last Tuesday through Friday, and I have provided the link here for the materials. CDE uses what they call the box, and so this houses the PowerPoints, the materials, and a lot of helpful resources for each program. And so the link here is provided, and it looks like this, and you don't have to necessarily, it makes it look like you have to sign in or create a login, but you actually can download it, and it just takes a few minutes, and then it will download. So just a little tip for you on that. But please take a look at these things, download whatever you need. It is really helpful, especially for this school year with a lot of changes and due to the pandemic, and some Q&A questions that were answered, and you'll find it very, very helpful for you to continue with your compliance. Moving on. So we're going to take a closer look at the CARES Act. And as you know, the CARES Act is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This funding was provided to, for districts to have emergency relief funds to address the impact of COVID. The three funding sources are the coronavirus, the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, and the governor's emergency education relief. And so these are the funding sources. So as you see, we have the, when you accepted the learning loss mitigation funds, you signed assurances, and you agreed to the laws, the rules, and the terms of how your LEA we're going to spend the funds. So how the state and federal government ensure that the funds were used correctly happened through the FPM process. So using the CARES Act monitoring instrument, this link here on this slide will take you to the CDE website with all the FPM instruments, including the new CARES Act monitoring instrument. And in this CARES instrument, you will find 9 items for compliance. And what I found very helpful, and I really want to encourage everyone to download it today if you haven't already, but take a look at the Appendix A. And this is in the back of the instrument. And here you're going to find the allowable uses for each of the 3 funding sources, along with the latest U.S. Treasury guidance on the CR funds. So hopefully this is all making sense to you. And if not, I find that this instrument in particular really helps clarify and make those distinctions between the different funds. So the first 6 items of the instrument are somewhat of an overlap with the fiscal monitoring instrument. You will see a lot of familiarities and similarities. You'll see time and effort requirements, allowable costs, cash management, procurement, your equipment, and your inventory management system, and also just your necessary reporting. So we know that in the next 3 items, CARES Act items 7, 8, and 9, these are the ones that are specific to each of the funding sources. So in item 7, this specifically addresses the coronavirus relief fund. And remember, this requires LEAs to maintain adequate written records about how the CR funds were received, dispersed, and spent. And also too, it does state that on October 19th, the U.S. Department of Treasury issued further guidance to provide administrative flexibility to LEAs. And so under this flexibility, LEAs that do not have to document and demonstrate allowability for costs if it's under the amount of $500 per elementary and secondary school student. However, CDE does recommend that it is better if you do keep documentation of the allowable expenses. So again, at the back in the appendix, this definitely gives more explanation about it. The CR allowable use of funds, again, were to spend on necessary expenditures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so here it is just a kind of shortened version of the allowability uses. And so you could use it for expanding broadband capacity, hiring new teachers in response to COVID, developing an online curriculum, acquiring computers, digital devices. Perhaps you had to install additional ventilation or air filtering equipment, or you incurred additional transportation or additional costs of providing meals. And so these are, the allowable uses for the CR funds. For CARES Act, item 8, the program requirements are for funds, again, to maintain adequate written records for funds that were received, dispersed, and spent on the programs. Also, again, in a compliance with the purposes of the GEAR funds. And so for these, the funds, again, were meant to pay for activities that were directly supporting the pupil academic achievement, and also to mitigate the learning loss related to the COVID-19 school closures. So here are some examples. So you could use it for the expansion of learning supports, extending instructional time or services, providing additional academic services, if you had pupil support, and addressing health and safety concerns related to the pandemic. And again, I direct you to the Appendix A in the instrument that gives you the full description on each of these. In CARES Act item 9, this is addressing the ESSER funds, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. It requires the districts to maintain adequate records on how the ESSER funds were, again, received, dispersed, and spent. And also it requires that the activities were part of the allowable use. So here are some samples of the permissible activities under CARES Act Section 18003. There were additionally these 12, and so they would include coordination and preparedness and response efforts of the LEAs with relevant agencies, addressing unique needs of your low-income students, children with disabilities, English learners, racial and ethnic minorities, students experiencing homelessness, and foster care youth, including outreach and service delivery. And also you have staff development, supplies to sanitize and clean your facilities, mental health services, activities to maintain the continuity and operation of services. So again, there's a broad range of allowable uses for the ESSER funds. And then again, just highlighting the Appendix A, which is the allowable costs under this, the CARES Act. And so you'll get, again, a lot more information about the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund in general, specifically with the Governor's Emergency Relief, Education Relief, Coronavirus Relief Fund, and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. And so now I am going to pass it on to Jeannie, who will talk about the latest revisions with the annual update for the 21-22 LCAP.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to provide an update on where the CDE is in the process to revise the annual update section for the 2021-22 LCAP that LEAs will be preparing and submitting by July 1st of 2021. Next slide, please. So last month, I shared the first version of a template and instructions for the annual update that addressed the 2019-20 LCAP and the Learning Continuity Plan. And CDE had created this version for input. Since then, CDE has themed and used the input received from version 1 to create a draft version number 2, which they have shared with multiple stakeholders and are continuing to solicit feedback. You can see the links for version 2 in the slide and the request for continued feedback down at the bottom. Next slide, please. So to review, you know that specific legislation in response to the context created by the pandemic created the requirement to revise the annual update. SB 98 removed the requirement for LEAs to adopt a LCAP for the 2021 school year. And in place of the LCAP, SB 98 required LEAs to adopt a learning continuity plan for LEAs to address how they would continue learning during school closures and how they would address learning loss in response to the conditions created by the COVID crisis. Additionally, SB 820 requires LEAs to complete an annual update for the 2019-20 LCAP and the 2021 Learning Continuity Plan, where LEAs are required to report out on what occurred related to each of these plans and report the related expenditures. These new requirements have necessitated revisions to the annual update component to be used in conjunction with the LCAP template for the 2020-21 LCAP. And statute requires the superintendent of public instruction, in consultation with the executive director for the State Board of Education, to make these revisions to the annual update and or any revisions to the LCAP template by January 31st of 2021. So let's take a look at the next slide to see where we are now. And it's important that while the timeline for collecting stakeholder input to inform the development of the 21-22 annual update template and instructions is by necessity being compressed, the CDE has conducted multiple stakeholder input sessions to obtain feedback and generate ideas. Specifically in December, CDE has presented the revised draft template and instructions for the 2021-22 LCAP annual update version 2. They have presented this to the LCAP Advisory Committee, to the California Practitioners Advisory Group, to the LCFF Equity Coalition, and to stakeholders participating in the Tuesdays at 2 session this month, as well as continue to solicit written feedback from stakeholders to the CDE. And they will continue to solicit the written feedback through the end of this week. The link included in the slide to the SBE information memorandum provides an overview of the feedback the CDE has received up to December and outlines the continuing process. Included in the memorandum are attachments of the drafts, version 1 and version 2, stakeholder feedback, including the initial communication from the Equity Coalition for version 1. And it's important to note that another memorandum will be developed to reflect the current process, and that will likely be shared in January. Next slide, please. So today I will show you a quick look at version 2. And I encourage you, as does the CDE, to look at the draft template and the instructions. And if you haven't already, please email your feedback to CDE at the LCFF at cde.ca.gov address. You have a unique perspective and may have important insight that will inform how to make the template the most transparent and most manageable and meaningful. So here in looking at the draft, you'll see again that the template includes the outward facing prompts for the reader. And there are separate instructions that include much more detailed or technical information, which is required to be included in the responses. So as I said, your input is important to support the development of a process that's clear, manageable, and helps stakeholders understand what has occurred and supports informed planning and decision-making for the next 2020-21, 2022 LCAP. This slide shows in version 2 that the LEA, what the LEA would report for each goal. You can see here reporting out actual data and expenditures. And you can see in the analysis section that it includes a description of successes and challenges in implementing the actions and services to achieve the goal through February 2020 or the end of the school year as applicable. And then it includes a description of how funds budgeted for actions and services that were maybe not implemented through the end of the school year, how those funds were used to support students, families, teachers, and staff following the closure of schools in 2020. During this week's Tuesdays at 2 webinar, Josh Strong from CDE indicated that the overall analysis section that you see at the bottom of your screen is intended to be completed once as an overall reflection and response to all of the goals included in the LCAP that are being reviewed or updated. This section includes a reflection on the progress made toward goals in the 1920 LCAP in light of the context of COVID-19 and based on available state and local data and stakeholder input, and a description of the relationship of the goals and related metrics and actions with the development of the new goals in the 2021-24 LCAP. And in the discussion, the CDE stressed the importance of including local data in the absence of state data. Next slide, please. Okay, in this slide, we see in version 2, the second component of the annual update, which addresses the learning continuity plan. It is broken down by sections in the plan. Again, keep in mind the instructions are separate and require the technical information about what is required to be included in the section. This slide shows the first 3 sections: in-person instructional offering, distance learning, and pupil learning loss. Each of these includes a section for a description of substantive differences between the planned actions and budgeted expenditures for in-person and what was implemented and expended on the actions. And the pupil learning loss section also includes a description of the effectiveness of the efforts to address pupil learning loss in the 2021 school year, and a description of the successes and challenges in addressing pupil learning loss in the 2021 school year. So we see that specific reference in the pupil learning loss section. Next slide, please. Version 2 also includes additional action sections from the learning continuity plan that are reported as separate categories. So included is a standalone section for a description about the successes and challenges in monitoring and supporting mental health and social emotional well-being in the 2020-21 school year. Likewise, a standalone section of a description describing successes and challenges in implementing pupil and family engagement, and a standalone section addressing successes and challenges in providing school nutrition. Additionally included in this draft is a reporting of the estimated actual amounts for actions in these sections, as well as we saw in the other sections, a description of any substantive differences between planned actions and budgeted expenditures in these 3 additional sections. Next slide, please. Version 2 also includes an overall analysis section, and this section is intended to apply to the totality of the sections in the LCP, in the Learning Continuity Plan. It includes an explanation of how lessons learned from implementing in-person and distance learning programs have informed the development of goals and actions in the 21-24 LCAP. And it includes a section for an explanation of how pupil learning loss will continue to be assessed and addressed through the goals and actions in the 21-24 LCAP, and especially for pupils with unique needs. And the third component of the overall analysis requires a description of substantive differences between the description of actions or services identified as contributing toward meeting the increased or improved services requirement for unduplicated pupils and the actions or services actually implemented to meet the increased or improved services requirement. So 3 key distinct sections in that overall analysis. Let's go to the next slide. During the Tuesdays at 2 session this week, CDE asked for specific feedback on this section, and they asked about an explanation of how lessons learned from implementing in-person and distance learning programs have informed the development of the goals for the new LCAP. And they specifically asked how to include the components of distance learning in the response and how that should be articulated either in the prompt in the template and or in the instructions. And you may recall from your distance learning program, there's those 6 components of the distance learning section. So they were asking, how could that be clearly included? And so it sounded like they may be considering including those components separately. CDE also indicated and stressed the requirement to include the required component from the Learning Continuity Plan that addressed pupil learning loss. And as you know, this section included learning loss in the areas of English language arts, English language development, and math, and specifically identified strategies specific to unique populations, including English learners, low-income students, foster youth, and students with disabilities. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the next slide provides an update, which CDE provided at the Tuesdays at 2 on the 2020-21 LCAP. And just to confirm, the LCAP template approved last January will be used for the 2021-22 LCAP. There will, however, be a revision, not to the content, but to the dates, so that it will reflect the 21-22 through 23-24 3-year period, okay? And CDE indicated they'll be posting the template with the revised dates next week. And in conjunction with that, our ELCAP will be updated to reflect those revised dates as soon as possible. And the next slide, we can see here that with these components, the development of the annual update template and the final version of the LCAP template in January, the revised annual update and instructions will be approved in during the period February through June. LEAs will work on the development of their LCAP and the LCAP annual update using the template adopted by CDE last year and the revision that will be adopted in January. And then by July 1st, school districts, county offices, and charter schools will adopt their 2020-21-22 LCAP. So that's an update on the revision and the process moving forward for LCAP. And now I'll turn it over to Bonnie, who will finish up today's training.
Thank you, Jeannie. Okay, finally today, we just wanted to provide you with some updates on several topics. We'll be looking at what we know about the CONAP timelines and some changes that are coming, some new requirements for web postings. We just wanted to review that, some reminders about CARES Act spending timeline, and a brief update on the dashboard. So let's start with the consolidated application. CDE recently indicated that they anticipate the timelines for the winter CONAP release and the spring submission will be the same as in the past, the regular submission date. So CARS is anticipated to be released on January 15th, and the submission date will be February 28th. However, they did indicate that the system may remain open as long as through April, but they want to close off the system at least by that time so they can institute the June timelines as we've had in the past. And that would mean that the CARS release would be May 15th and the June release would, June submission would be June 30th. So we're back on track for the timelines for this year. We did learn of one change to the application on the next slide. And that has to do with the Title I school allocation page. This page is going to be changed. It's actually going back to how it was previously submitted in the last few years. So this year, the page is going to be pre-populated with prior year's CalPADS numbers. This was the practice in the past, but it was changed a couple years ago, and we've gotten a number of calls from districts who've run into problems since they made that change. So they are going back. So school numbers for free and reduced lunch and enrollment will be populated with 2019 CalPAD free and reduced price meal and enrollment numbers. Now, districts have the option of using those pre-populated numbers, or they can use current year. So that'd be 2020 CalPADS number. That's always been an option for districts. To use the current numbers, the district, and I say district because generally the school allocation page doesn't apply as much to charter schools because you don't have to rank your schools because you usually only have one school. But to use, if you want to change those numbers, the district will have to go back to the information from the 2020 CalPADS report 1.17 and then filter that for students age 5 through 17. So that's an option for the districts if you want to use it. We'll look at why you might change those numbers in a minute. But let's first look at the next slide as to why this change backward. The change to using prior year numbers was made to align with the school allocation timeline. LEAs, and again, we say districts because that's primarily who it's applicable to. Districts are required to rank their schools based on federally defined procedures at the beginning of the school year. The ranking procedure leads to identification of schools that are eligible for Title I funding, those the district chooses to fund, and it requires the district to identify those schools and notify those schools. Federal requirements allow for multiple sources of low-income data to be used for ranking, but you have to use the same data for all related procedures. And most districts use free and reduced price data for low-income, ranking their schools for this process. So at the beginning of the school year, the only certified free and reduced price meal data available to the district is the prior fall CalPADS report. So that's the data schools should be using to rank their schools. The school allocation page in the CONAP is a reporting of that ranking. That's not when you should rank your schools. It's just reporting what you did the prior spring. Therefore, the 2019 CalPADS numbers would represent the most recent certified data that could have been used for that ranking. Changing those numbers can significantly impact school funding and eligibility. And for the past couple of years, we get calls every year from districts who say that if they change the numbers, the schools fall out of ranking. They have schools that were funded and mid-year, they suddenly fall out of ranking. And that's not what you want to do. So that's the reason for the change. So next slide, why might you change those numbers? Well, you might change those numbers if you found that there were significant changes in either your enrollment or free and reduced price numbers subsequent to your initial ranking. So that could be school closures, and that wouldn't show up in the prior year's data. So if you had schools that closed, also demographic shifts, if you had significant shift for some reason in students attending different schools, and that shifted your poverty data, that might be a reason why you might want to use current year's data. Any other changes should be done in the following spring. You don't want to change school eligibility mid-year. Schools have Title I funding for a full year. They develop a plan, and that plan should be implemented for a year. Any changes, if a school falls out, you wait till the next year and fund them in the following year. So hopefully this will be helpful, and we won't be getting calls from districts struggling with that problem. And we will be doing a CONAP workshop early in February as soon as we have all the information out. We'll get information out to you on that. All right, next topic is web postings. And you've heard that mentioned in a number of the prior presentations, but we wanted to update you on some changes that have taken place this year. And most of these weren't included in either Senate Bills 98 or 820 that passed earlier this year. And a lot of them are based on the posting requirements for the LCAP. So your LEA's learning continuity and attendance plan must be prominently posted on the webpage of your LEA website. Also, posting is required for the budget overview for parents that you've just completed. This was previously, again, connected to your LCAP posting. Legislation clarified that the LCAP Federal Addendum also needs to be prominently posted on the homepage. This has been something that people had questions about. Does it have to be? Does it not? It's now been clarified. And for those LEAs with comprehensive support and improvement schools, the responses to the LEA prompts also need to be posted on the district website. For districts that have authorized charter schools, the LCAPs for those charter schools also need to be posted now on the website of the authorizing district. Also, there's a couple new requirements for charter schools. One is the requirement to post a notice, and it's related to the enrollment requirement, indicating that the school shall not discourage enrollment for any reason. I believe CDE is working on a template for that, or a format for that notice. And the other is only applies to charter organizations with 2 or more schools that are in different counties. And in that case, they need to post recordings of the board meetings on their websites. Now, to help you with the web postings, we have, and it's posted, will be posted with our handouts from this meeting. We have a list of all, and I say all cautiously, all required postings. We've done our best to include everything, but we may have missed something. So let us know if you come across something that's missing on this list, but we'll continually be updating it. You can see it gives a brief description of what it is that needs to be posted. It gives you the education code reference, and then also any notes. And we've noted those that are new postings on the document. So that's available for you. And Amy Tomomatsu is not with us today, but I need to give a shout out to her for working on this. All right. Next, let's take a look, just a follow up on CARES Act. And we just wanted a reminder because those funding deadlines are coming very quickly for some of those funds. So we just wanted to review that very quickly. Next slide. All right, you can see in bold there, it's the coronavirus relief funds that we need to be looking at right now. Those are the funds that expire as of December 30th. And you heard about that a little bit earlier in the presentation. Then, as you can see, the next funds you need to start thinking about are those state general funds that are included in the learning loss mitigation funds. Those will, again, those expire on June 30th, 2021. So those will be the next ones that you need to think about. You have for your ESSER and GEAR funds, you have considerably more time to spend those. You have until September 30th, 2022 for both of those funding sources. You'll also notice that the initial date is different for those. You can go back further for coronavirus relief funds and general funds. You can go back to March 1st to count those expenditures, whereas ESSER and GEAR, the timeline is March 13th. All right. All right, so the question always comes at the end of a grant period, what about the period of availability? And we know that coronavirus relief funds are a little bit different than our other funds because they come through the US Treasury, not through the Department of Education. And therefore the requirements are slightly different. So since there were a lot of questions about deadline, we want to just kind of address this again now. So the Treasury Department clarified, and CDE also followed up with information that LEAs need to, what does it mean to spend those funds? What it means is that the funds have to have been incurred during the covered period. The covered period, again, March 1st through December 30th, 2020 for these coronavirus relief funds. So what does it mean that the funds are incurred? Well, and what if something comes late after that time? They're saying that LEAs need to place the order with the reasonable expectation that the orders will be received by December 30th. But if they're received after that due to delays, then those can be spent on that cost. However, it's expected that you would finalize that expenditure within 90 days of that period. Okay. So CDE on the next slide on their FAQs again clarified that again, and essentially saying the same thing, that it's not necessary to receive any devices or equipment by December 30th, provided at the time the order was placed, you were expecting to receive it. So bottom line, they're saying that LEAs shouldn't order devices late, and at the time the order is placed, there's no expectation that you're going to get it. So if you place the order and it's not reasonable for you to expect that you'd receive it, then that wouldn't be allowable. But if you place it in a time you expect to receive it by the 30th, doesn't come for one reason or another, you can certainly pay for that. So, this is the time we start kind of thinking about what you can spend those funds on. So coronavirus relief funds are the only ones expiring now. All right, next slide. Just wanted to mention that we do have a dashboard posting, and that sounded very confusing at first because we thought, what does that mean? There's not going to be a dashboard. Well, there is a dashboard, but it's what they call a slimmed down version. And it's slimmed down because of waivers and from the federal government and state legislation that suspended much of the data that goes into the dashboard. So on the next slide, we'll take a little bit closer look at that. So back in March, the US Department of Education approved California's waiver for accountability and reporting requirements for 1920. So that did not require the testing. SB 98, again, impacted the dashboard by saying it prohibited CDE from reporting state and local indicator data and identifying LEAs for differentiated assistance and intervention. So LEAs identified for differentiated assistance in 2019-20 will remain eligible and are eligible for 2021 school year and schools identified for CSI and additional targeted support and improvement, that if they were identified in 1920, they remain eligible for the current school year. So no new schools will be identified using dashboard data because the data needed isn't there. So what does the dashboard contain? It has updated contact information for schools and districts. It includes updated enrollment data. It includes a link to the CDE webpage with CalPAD's report, and there's a new section indicating whether the school is a charter school or a DAS alternative school. So despite the suspension, we still have a dashboard, but as you say, it's a slimmed down dashboard. All right, next slide. Okay. So let's looking ahead for 2021, a few changes that we know of for the dashboard and a few clarifications. For 2021, status and change will be calculated differently. Status will be based on new 2021 data, but change will be based using the 2019 data and 2020-21 data. So it'll be your 2021 data minus your 2019 data will result in your change for the 2021 dashboard. Okay. Also beginning in 2021, just a reminder that for students with disabilities who receive services in another district or in a county program or in a non-public school, there's a change. And as you may recall, this has been sort of a phase-in of accountability being moved from the district of service to the district of residence. So in 2021, the final phase of that roll-in will result in data on all indicators for those students being sent back to the district of residence for inclusion in the dashboard. School level data, however, will remain with the school of attendance. And if you'd like more information, you can go to this link and there's information that summarizes and provides you more detail on those changes. Okay, so those are just a few updates and some things that you probably, some things you may have already known and some things that might be new, but we didn't want to add too much to your plate for the next few weeks. All right. So we'll leave the chat open for a few minutes in case you have questions. We said, oh, there won't be any questions today. I'm looking in the chat. I know there are a lot of questions and we apologize not being able to get to all of them, but the Q&A, we will get it out as soon as possible. The reason we use the Q&A format is we find that many of your questions certainly aren't simple questions, and sometimes they require us to verify information with the department, and other times they're more complex than we have time to go into here. We also find that sometimes information gets misinterpreted when it's in a meeting and it's not in writing, and we don't want that to happen. Someone will say, I heard in a meeting, and have that be misinterpreted. So we will get you those Q&As, and we're always here via email if you have questions at sfp@laco.edu. From all of us, we want to thank you for joining us this year, and we want to wish you much health and happiness in the new year. On the next slide, you'll see our links to our names, contact information. We look forward to connecting with you in the new year, but in the meantime, please contact us if you have questions. Our office is closed Thursday and Friday for the next 2 weeks, and some of the team will be taking some time off, but someone will always be there to respond to your questions at any time over the holidays. Otherwise, we will see you either in January at our fiscal meetings, our LCAP meetings, or our next state and federal directors meeting on January 21st. So I join all of you in wishing goodbye to 2020 and hello 2021, and may it be a better year for all of us. Take care and happy holidays.